Hi everyone, welcome back to the DS3 podcast. My name is Bianca Grunbaum, and today we are very lucky to be joined by Professor Benjamin Noble. He's an assistant professor in the UCSD Political Science Department, and his work blends political research and data science by studying political rhetoric, using statistical methods and text analysis. Professor Noble, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we are super excited to be able to talk to you kind of about, politics, AI, teaching methods, all of it. But first, you just mind telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an assistant professor in the Political Science Department. I've been here for about 3 years, and my research focuses on presidential and congressional speech and rhetoric and analyzing the text that's put out by the president and Congress. And then a lot of my teaching focuses on American politics, on statistical research methods, and more recently on how to incorporate AI into the research process and using AI in the classroom.
Yeah, I mean, that's super cool. It's definitely a very topical thing to discuss.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
It's evolving all the time.
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, to start off a little bit, kind of talk about your research.
Yeah.
Obviously, you have a pretty extensive research portfolio for only being here for 3 years.
Thank you.
And it focuses a lot on analyzing, political rhetoric, like you said. And I know you have one paper on the effects of QAnon endorsement, right?
Yes.
On kind of candidate kind of quality and effect, right?
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit more on your research subjects in general? Yeah.
Sure. So I'm really interested broadly in how members of Congress and how the president present themselves to the public in what they say and how they act, because that has a huge effect on how you and I perceive those actors. I mean, I'll just say for myself, even as a political scientist, I'm not always following what our members of Congress are doing every day,
right,
or, every little thing that's happening that's coming out of the White House all the time. And so a lot of what we learn about politicians comes from what they say.
Yes.
And what politicians say is obviously strategic, and they're planning and they're thinking about what kind of impression they want to convey to us. And so I'm really interested in studying that. In the QAnon paper that you mentioned there, we were looking at whether candidates sort of endorsing or embracing QAnon was going to be an effective political strategy. We were sort of surprised that so many people were doing it because it just doesn't seem like a very popular or very mainstream thing. But again, candidates are strategic, and so we thought maybe there's something we're missing. And so we conducted some experiments varying whether a candidate endorsed or didn't endorse QAnon, and we found that actually, even among people that we thought would find this kind of rhetoric appealing, strong Republicans, people who had anti-establishment attitudes, they didn't like these candidates any more than candidates who didn't use this kind of language.
Yeah.
Strong Democrats, people who really had establishment views, really didn't like these candidates. But among the people that we thought would like it, their attitude didn't really change. And so sort of suggesting that maybe politicians, they have a strategy, but that strategy may not always work the way that they think it's going to work.
And that is super interesting to me. So I think, as a constituent, as a voter, I think sometimes we take for granted the idea that maybe this rhetoric is very kind of scripted, and we don't necessarily consider that when we're looking at what they say. I mean, I know our president right now has a tendency to speak very off the cuff, or seemingly so, right? And so I think that's a kind of maybe a shift that we're seeing towards where we perceive it as more off the cuff or as more I don't know how to say this, but impromptu. But in reality, maybe it isn't, right? It still is kind of a scripted behavior.
Yeah, to some extent, I think there's a mix. There's a mix of a style or something that's been developed, and you could even think that style is strategic, where, every single tweet or every single off-the-cuff remark may not be planned, but it's all part of a style and a kind of image that the president might want to convey as somebody who stands up for people who are forgotten, or stands up for people who he perceives are persecuted by the political system or against the media, these sort of things. Every remark may not be scripted, but the strategy certainly is something that I would think has been thought about a lot.
And that's a really good point. I think, he is or in general, kind of this new wave of, right-wing populism is about the outsider, about kind of coming at attacking it from the outside, saying, look at the establishment, look at the, the bureaucracy and what it's doing wrong, and kind of, I think that language is a big part of why they've been successful, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting for sure.
Yeah.
And, kind of piggybacking off that a little bit, we see a very, very strong grasp party unity, and in this day and age especially. We just saw Bill Cassidy, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, just got ousted in his primary, and he had spoken out against President Trump, had called him guilty for his actions on January 6th, and voted to impeach him. And we are seeing the repercussions of that now. I mean, my question for you then, I guess, do you think that is a unique issue to our time due to maybe right-wing populism and kind of the ascension of that? Or is it maybe more about, social media and the fact that we can observe more of what our politicians are saying and are doing in our daily lives?
Yeah, I would say, is it fair to say both? And?
Yeah.
Like, I would say both of those
Yeah.
things are probably contributing to this, but I would say many of these trends fall under this topic that political scientists call nationalization, this idea that what we care about in politics is national politics. It used to be the case in the 70s and the 80s that people would be really happy to vote for a Republican member of Congress, but a Democratic president. And, maybe that member of Congress would be focused on local issues and the president's focused on something. And, you might split your vote in this way. And today we see way less of that. In that period of the 70s and 80s, maybe 50% of senators were a different party than the same state voted for the president. Today, there's like Susan Collins.
Yeah, right.
There's like very few.
Yeah.
And so it's all part of this trend where both voters and politicians in this sort of reinforcing cycle focus more and more on national issues, immigration, climate,
Right.
And the president as a person, as something that like an object that we all attach to. And we're like, well, are you for or against the president? And that defines everything. That's kind of why you see even, I just saw an ad for a candidate running for treasurer in like local government.
Right.
And she in her ad is saying, I stand up to Donald Trump.
Yes.
That's sort of that's not something that we would think of the treasurer as like key qualities.
Yeah, it
like,
doesn't matter, right.
Exactly. And so some of that's driven by media. There's a lot less local media today than there used to be, and a lot more online media, which when you're online, you want to appeal to the broadest possible audience. And, not everybody cares about San Diego politics. They care about President Trump.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to focus on that. And what's more is that voters themselves have sorted. So if you're a Democrat, you're also probably liberal, and you hold a lot of attitudes that are, you're probably pro-environment, you're probably anti-gun, Republican the opposite. And so candidates then line up in that way, and it creates this sort of like column of loyalty where everybody's kind of marching in lockstep, and voters are rewarding you or punishing you based on that.
And that is so interesting. It's like, nationalization, we talk about it with the president, with the federal government, obviously. I was even thinking like Zohran Mamdani. I was thinking about like the New York City mayor's race.
Right.
That was a big issue. Like I would get a lot of things on my Instagram feed, stuff like that, about Mamdani, about, the debates at Curtis Lee one. It's like, I don't live anywhere near New York. Like I am not going to be voting this election or anything like that. But it's because, we take these kind of like microcosms of elections of subgroups of people. And New York is, a very diverse city, a lot of people, obviously. And we extrapolate them to be issues larger than their actual municipalities or their actual jurisdictions are.
Yeah, that's a great insight.
Which I think is like, it's very interesting just because, again, like you mentioned, part of that is probably because of the advent of social media and this kind of access to everybody, but it's so different than how it was even just a few decades ago.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so incredibly so. So it's very, I think, intriguing and something that people, I even as someone who studies political science, you take it for granted.
Yeah, it just is kind of how things are.
Right,
Yeah.
It definitely wasn't.
It was not, that shift really came in like the 80s and the 90s. But yeah.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And kind of, on that same line, you are the co-author of a paper on political unity and messaging, or party unity and messaging. And you actually use in this research a statistical model to basically, and I'm reading this here, to determine multidimensional rhetorical cohesion. Big words, but am I correct in saying that basically means, it's a measure of how aligned a party is in their speech?
Yeah, you've nailed it. Yeah, so this is a paper that I'm working on with my co-author, Gretchen Lin at Texas A&M, and what she and I are interested in this paper is this idea of rhetorical cohesion. How similar do two speakers or does a party sound? Parties benefit just like a brand benefits when it has one cohesive message. And so for members of Congress, if they're debating a healthcare bill, maybe they really want to focus on the fact that this is going to lower costs. And if everybody says that the bill is going to lower costs, you and I, we're not always paying attention to politics. We're surfing and going to yoga and studying and teaching class.
Right.
And, I might only hear what one person says. But eventually, like if I hear enough people saying it and I'm not going to miss something, like I learned that, this is a bill about lowering costs. Great, I like lowering costs.
Right.
But for members of Congress themselves, they may want to say that, but there may be a message that works better for their district. Maybe their district has a lot of seniors in it, and they want to say, this bill is going to really help seniors by expanding access to Medicare.
Sure.
But then if that person's talking about Medicare, and this person's talking about cost, and this person's talking about healthcare as a human right, well, suddenly we're hearing a lot of different messages, and I'm like, well, what is it about?
Right.
What's the deal? And so there's this trade-off. The party wants everybody to say the same thing, perhaps, but individuals, well, they might want to say that, but they might want to say something else. And so we're interested in this paper in trying to understand how similar are any two messages, and then in the aggregate, all the parties' messages on an issue.
Right. And I mean, that's so interesting. 'Cause, it's like the debate of the party platform versus the individual, representative doing the best for their district, for their people. And it's the fight between that. I think, talking about nationalization and everything like that is a very different kind of, a very different direction than it used to be, maybe, where it's like not as much about, or we like to think it is, maybe it isn't about the constituents, right?
Yeah.
It maybe it's drifting more towards keeping yourself in line with the party or keeping yourself in line with, the messaging.
Yeah.
And that's
for those same reasons you're sort of suggesting earlier of like if you go too far away, that's probably going to be painful for you as a member of Congress.
Yeah, but yeah, super interesting. And the part that I think as, someone with some data background, it's a data science podcast, we're very interested in the part about statistical model that you use, right? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and kind of talk about that?
Sure. So this measurement, I mean, this question of how similar are any two speeches is a tricky question that's hard to answer because speeches obviously are vary on a lot of different dimensions. Text is multidimensional. And so we wanted to try to figure out how we could measure such a thing. And so some of the technology, these embedding models that underlie these large language models like ChatGPT were really helpful in generating these measures. So in the paper, we say what we're interested in measuring is whether two people are saying the same thing about the same issue. And so there's like two pieces to that. There's the same issue. Because I would expect people, if you're talking about the Iran war, and if you're talking about healthcare, you're going to obviously going to say different topics.
Yeah.
So we need to know, like, are these two speeches about the same topic? And there are some topic models that have been around for maybe almost 30 years now, 25 years, that are good at doing this. They basically look at a big bunch of text. Like you can think we use all of the speeches in the congressional record from like 1994 to today. And so we take those speeches, and this model works by looking at what words appear in speeches and how often those words co-occur, and looking across documents and try to assess, like, what are the topics based on the words that recur in these documents. And so then we can say, okay, this speech is probably about immigration, this other speech is about immigration, we can compare those. This speech is about immigration, this speech is about healthcare, probably can't compare those. So once we have two speeches that are about the same topic, now we want to know how similar are those speeches. And these embedding models that underlie large language models, so like part of training a large language model is that you want the model to be able to predict the next word in a sequence. Yes. But to make that prediction, the model has to know what's likely to come next. And it figures out what's likely to come next by essentially creating, a good analogy is like think about a graph. It creates a graph of where words sit, where words that are similar, like cat and dog, are going to be next to each other, and like dog and surfboard are farther apart because they're not similar. And you can do the same thing with a whole speech. And you can put it into this graph. And so we can learn, like, okay, these two immigration speeches, or like, let's go back to our healthcare example. These two healthcare speeches about cost are here, and this one about seniors is over here. We can measure that distance. And so the similarity that we're capturing is really broad because speeches might differ because they emphasize different justifications. One might be angrier than another one. One might talk about the president and one might talk about local politics. All these things kind of get baked into that measure of similarity, but it's a way to assess how similar are these two speeches.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, as data science students, we learn about, LLMs and how to make them, all this stuff that you're talking about, but it's so cool to have it applied in a context I don't think people think about, right? It's like, yes, we train these models on large, corpuses or corpus of data, right? But we don't think about maybe how it can actually be used in a space like politics, or where this is very, very important work to be done.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, I mean, it is because, we don't, if we're relying only on, our perception of these speeches and not actually on the tools that we have at our disposal to analyze them, I would imagine you fall into the pitfalls of, it's like subjectivity or, what you think a speech is talking about, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It seems like a pretty objective measure of the, cohesion of two speeches.
That's what we hope, and that's what we try to argue, and something that we try to be sensitive to is there's a balance between, if you and I read these speeches, it's hard for us sometimes to hold all of the similarities and differences in our head that the mathematical model can do better, but we also want to make sure that what the model's outputting also makes sense to us as humans, and we're capturing something real and it's not like an artifact of these embeddings.
That's a really good point too, because it might pick up something that we don't notice, right?
Correct.
Or vice versa. Yeah, it's super interesting.
For better or worse.
For better or worse, right? Exactly. So kind of, I guess, as a result of that study, Did you guys, or I know you're working on it, it sounds
Mhm.
like, so have you found any results yet about party cohesion or about, kind of speech cohesion, things like that?
Yeah, so we found a couple interesting things. One thing that we were interested in the model was sort of this paper. We're really focusing on showing that this measure works and that it has a lot of different applications. And so there's a lot of hypotheses in the existing political science literature that people have written about or measured, maybe in this more qualitative way, but haven't been subjected to this large analysis. And so we look at a lot of different factors that we think might induce cohesion among members of Congress, things like elections, whether issues are salient, whether a party's in the majority, whether members are from similar or different types of districts. And so one of the really interesting things that we found that was a little unexpected is we thought that whether it's a presidential or a midterm election, these are going to be times where everybody's really paying attention. And so you want to have a cohesive message. Everybody's going to maybe be more similar and kind of on their best party behavior. And in midterms, that's true. That's one of the biggest predictors in our model of cohesion is a midterm election. What's interesting is that in presidential elections, parties actually get less cohesive.
Really?
And that's really not what we expected.
Yeah.
We thought that would actually be the biggest predictor.
Right, exactly.
And so a reason that we think sort of after sort of observing that counterintuitive result, a congressional election is really about the parties and it's about Congress. And so maybe that makes it easy to coordinate around a message. But in the presidential election, the president, you might have complicated feelings about your party's president. Everybody wants to support the president, but there are a lot of members who maybe they want to get a little bit of distance or they want to emphasize something different. And so maybe it's harder to coordinate when you have the president on one hand who everybody knows they need to be catering to, but also they have their own district election to worry about and they maybe need some distance. So
I mean, that does make sense though, I think. It's, because you think about the presidential election, you're trying to rally millions of people around one candidate.
Right.
And that is a very difficult issue regardless of who the candidate is.
That's right.
Because you're not going to be able to align, again, like you said, there is kind of this sorting of voters into these categories, but people don't work like that. It's
right.
People don't, not all Democrats are liberal or anti-gun,
right.
things like that. And so I think that is a really interesting
voters
point
are
to
complicated.
make. Yeah, well, people are complicated. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's super cool. And I do think, again, part of the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast was because I do think that there's a lot of work to be done with data science and using these kind of techniques in fields that people often don't consider. And I think that this is, really important work because politics affects all of us in the United States. Obviously, we all have our president, all of our representatives, and I do think that a lot of people might take for granted the idea that, the techniques that we are learning in classes that we are using and maybe tech roles can also be applied to do things like this.
Yeah.
And to learn about these kind of more, I don't want to say obscure, but maybe less, more taken for granted patterns in our daily lives, in our society.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of, I guess, off that then, this is a bit more of a trivial question, but do you have a preferred programming language when you are doing this work? Is there something that you use more than another?
I mostly use R and Python.
Okay.
And they differ. Like R, I find is very good for data sort of munging, putting data together, running regressions, creating visualizations. And then Python is much more on the cutting edge for some of these, using these large language models and scraping text from the internet, these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So sort of depends on what I'm doing. I mean, increasingly, obviously I'm using AI as well to sort of help me write some of this code, run some of this code, figure out other ways to do things. And so that's even playing, a bigger role in the last couple of years, obviously.
Right. And I mean, it's super, again, I think I've taken some classes both in R and in Python, obviously. We focus very heavily on Python in our data science curriculum here. And I do think, it's very fascinating to me to see kind of the dichotomy between different fields and what they use to do effectively the same thing. And so I just think it's super fascinating because, in data science, we use a lot of Python. We do, even in our, data science 10 class, which is basic statistical, fundamentals, stuff like that, we use Python. But then I've taken almost, I feel the equivalent class and then used, solely R.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, there's, some, and obviously it's very rudimentary things, but still, it's very interesting to see kind of the dichotomy between
I think it's, I don't know where the split happens or whatever, but it's just at some point somebody in political science was we're doing R, and then we all learn R, and the people in data science we are doing Python.
Exactly, yeah, that's pretty funny, yeah. But again, I think that this, where I have actually used both, Python and R is doing research. I think that there is a lot of very cool opportunities at UCSD and in undergrad research to find a field that you are interested in and pursue it, whether it's data science or political science, bio, or a bunch of them. If someone is interested in getting into, political research or research in general, what advice would you give them?
I would say the best advice I can give you is take classes with professors who are teaching topics that you're interested in, and go to office hours, get to know them. We are always looking for opportunities to work with students. For instance, in this party cohesion project, I worked with a student, Justin, who was in my Intro to American Politics class. He came to office hours a lot. He reached out to me at the end of the quarter and said, if you ever need help with research, I'd love to get involved.
Sure.
And for this project, we wanted to try to evaluate the model's measure of cohesion versus what a human might perceive. And so Justin was so helpful in all of this. He worked with us. We gave him a bunch of speeches to read.
Yeah.
He was trying to pick which one was more similar. We compared that to the model to try to understand how well correlated these things were. And so, these are opportunities. There's always, something that's popping up. And I only know to ask the students who have expressed interest, and the students that I know that came to my, office. Like, always great to reach out to somebody who came to my office hours 3 times that I'm familiar with. And so I would say ask for opportunities, get to know the professors, because something will probably come up and we'll reach out.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's definitely just about, putting your foot in the door.
Exactly.
And getting it out there and asking. Yeah, I think people need to do more of that. So
and you don't even have to know what you want.
Right.
I mean, that's the thing. Just even to come to office hours, just to say hi and ask about research, say what you're interested in. That's you don't have to come with a question.
Right, exactly, yeah. That's so great. And I think, so kind of pivoting a little bit now away from the research for a second, part of the reason we're very happy to have you on today is because you do use a lot of AI in your teaching methods, which is super cool. And I think a lot of our viewers and people in general, myself included, are kind of grappling with how to best incorporate AI into our learning practices. So I guess my question for you is, how do you balance AI learning with lack for a better word, kind of the human learning?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's tricky. AI can be this sort of generative AI can be an incredible tool for learning in the fact that it's always available. It's infinitely patient. It will explain things to you in a million ways until you're satisfied. It'll make visualizations now. It'll write code for you to simulate something. It can be a great tool for learning. It can also be really tempting to use to shortcut learning, which I think that's true of any of us. When there's a magic box that will just do the thing for you at a pretty competent level, you're very tempted sometimes to just say well, I'm busy. I'll just this time I'll just outsource it and delegate it, and next time I'll do it the right way. And so some of it just comes down to some self-discipline and trying to resist the urge. And what I talk about in one of the classes I teach is this idea that I call cognitive agency, which is you can think about, I think one way that people think about AI is in a binary. Either this is a task where I use AI, this is a task where I don't use AI. And I think we're moving increasingly towards a world where that binary is sort of false, and that there's a spectrum of ways that you could use more or less AI on any given task. And so we could even take the same task, let's think about writing a script that runs a regression. Well, if you don't know what regression is, asking the model to write the script, you're not going to learn what regression is. And so it behooves you to write the code and maybe ask the LLM, what is this code doing? Can you explain this to me? Can you write this one line and then work through what that means? And that's a way to use AI to help with learning. And then, I would say for me, I know how to run a regression, I know how to write the code to run a regression, I know what it's doing. And so even though it's the same task, I've kind of learned that skill. And so I'll just ask maybe AI to write the code, because for me, delegating that isn't impairing my learning. But when I learn a new method that I'm not familiar with, that's when I'm back exactly to that place of well, I don't know what this is. I better write the code myself and work through it so that I know what it's doing. And so this idea of cognitive agency is given the task, what is my goal? Is my goal learning, or is my goal sort of efficiency and output? And then allocating some amount of your agency to the AI depending on your goal.
Definitely. And what I'm kind of hearing from you is the idea that if you are learning, if you are a student in any form, not just literally a student, but just learning anything, right? It's that is where it's dangerous to use AI, because it is replacing your learning.
Right.
But if you're using it to almost automate the work that you would have to be doing, it might not be a terrible thing to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's very. I think that distinction is important, because I think especially in kind of academia and like the classroom, it can get very blurred.
Yeah.
And that's something that I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because it's my understanding that do you use AI at all in your teaching, like to help with that kind of stuff? Can you talk about that a little
Yeah,
bit?
sure.
Yeah.
So I definitely do. And part of that is, again, because I know that it's a technology that's going to be really important for students on the job market to sort of engage and interact with it. And employers are sort of expecting students to have these skills. And so, and I also think it's a great way to expand what we do in the classroom. So I do have one class that I just taught for the first time this past winter that's literally about how to use AI in the research process. And that's a whole quarter where we're talking about research and AI and using that. But even in my non-AI classes, in my Intro to American Politics class, we have like a custom GPT that has access to all of the class notes and can generate study guides, do quizzes and all of this. So I think that's like a way to get your foot in the door and expand students learning beyond, I don't have infinite office hours.
Right.
And so this is a way at midnight when I'm asleep for somebody to practice for the exam. I'm going to be teaching this summer a class on sort of data science and causal inference. And there, I'm going to encourage students to use, I'm going to allow students to use, if they would like, to use any of these AI tools to help them with coding. Because I'm not going to teach, I'm going to focus on the statistics. And some people have learned R and some people haven't. Some people might know Python. Some people don't know any coding. And so here AI is a tool that students can use to learn some of the programming that maybe they didn't know or they need a refresher on, or translate between R and Python, these sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, I totally think that's like a very cool way to kind of use it, because in that sense, you are not, like for the kind of custom GPT, right, for the American Politics class, you're not saying no AI.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of not using AI at all causes people to almost maybe try to sneak around it, or try to kind of, maybe find a workaround. I don't know, but that's, I think in classes where I've had that, I do see, you hear people finding ways anyway, right? But kind of saying, no, let's take this tool that's going to be prevalent. It's not going away, right? As far as we can tell, right? It's here to stay. And so, taking this tool that is going to be useful on the job market, things like that, and giving them like structured exposure to it in the class. I think that's a very kind of cool idea.
Thanks. And I think it's important. I think what you're going to see more and more of is, in that same class, there's an in-class exam on a piece of paper with a pencil, no internet. And so, use AI as much as you want to study, but there's going to be a day where, you have to show me that you actually did use it to study.
Right. And, kind of say, use it as much as you want, but you need to know it.
Exactly.
And kind of like what you, said a little bit earlier about the idea that, you can use it when you know the stuff already, but you can't use it to replace the actual learning. Yeah. I mean, that's a very cool idea. Kind of, talking now about, you're in political science, obviously. I think in data science, I can say we do have, I'm a tutor for data science course. We do actually have our own AI tutor for the class. So that's something that we are experimenting with. It's also something that, we are data science. We kind of expect to do that a little bit more. My question for you is, have you received any pushback within the department about using these kind of AI techniques or stuff like that? Are people as open to it? Maybe?
I think, I wouldn't say that I've received pushback. I think I receive really good questions of the type that you're asking. And some of that is simply because some people, I'm sort of AI pilled and using this stuff and reading about it all the time. And some people don't have as much exposure to it. So they're not sure how to best use it or what should and shouldn't be allowed. And people are really curious. And then they ask questions like, well, how can we ensure students are actually using these tools in the right way? And so one of the things that I think is really important is not only teaching this class, but I also just led some workshops in my own political science department where I was going through some of the fundamentals of how to best use AI and best practices and how to incorporate this in the classroom in my own department. Because again, I think it's really important that people get comfortable and familiar with this technology. I mean, you all are using it, some of us are using it, and just trying to get everybody onto the same page. I think there are definitely things, and even I agree with this, there are things that I think are good for us to do as human beings. I could probably ask AI to write a letter of recommendation for a student, but kind of defeats the purpose of the letter of recommendation. I'm supposed to reflect on what I think about the student. I'm supposed to spend some time writing that letter. And so that's a thing that I should preserve for myself. Sometimes, when I'm writing a paper, sometimes I don't really know what I think until I've written down, I've started to write and I'm oh, I thought I understood that better than I understood it. So I will write a first draft, by myself because that's an important thing for me to do.
For sure. It's there's human processes that we've done for, a very, very long time. And it's almost not, it isn't the idea of abandoning all privilege because AI exists, right?
Right.
So it's not saying like, look, this glorious new thing, you know, we're all going to stop doing everything, right?
Yeah.
No, you know, it's a combination of the two. But I do think it's something that I've seen, you know, it's like, especially in the data science job market, that's a bit different than, you know, political science, stuff like that. But I think it still kind of rings true. You know, the idea is that if you're not using AI to, you know, like quote unquote vibe code, or if you're not using AI to, you know, help you, you are essentially falling behind. And so it's like there has to be a kind of, you know, like meeting ground, like a middle place,
Yes.
right? Where it's not just the fact that, you know, you say no AI ever, because that's not the way our society is trending as of right now. But also, like, you will be also left behind if you only use AI. So it's a very delicate kind of place where we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah. Or how is the tutor, like, how's the AI tutor? Do people receive that well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still in development. I know I'm not on the team directly working on it, but it's definitely people do use it, which is awesome.
Great.
But I think it's like, the idea is, I think essentially that, you know, again, by providing it for the students, by saying this isn't a forbidden thing, this isn't like, you know, the ultimately evil. Like, no, it's like, you know, in your job, if you go into data science, you very well might be using AI. And so it's like, I would hope so, right? Probably in some extent. So I think it's the idea of saying, you know, instead of we're saying absolutely no, nothing, you know, no way of that, it's like, no, okay, it exists. Let's help you figure out how to use it. Let's try to make it as constructive as possible, as helpful as possible. Not, you know, not so sycophantic, not so, you know, just like kind of trying to get you to the right place. But I think it's been a very interesting thing to see how people do use it. Because I still have people come to my office hours and still talk to me and talk to yourself. Obviously, it's not like there's nothing.
It's not replacing you.
No, it's not replacing. But I do think it's a supplement.
Yeah,
and that's the cool thing. And that, you know, office hours end at 5 most days.
Right.
So it's not like people can't come after that. So it's a great thing to be able to kind of have this tool for people.
Yeah.
I do think it's either this or it is the, you know, like complete, you know, acceptance or complete rejection. Maybe like then we have to find some sort of kind of like harmony. So,
yeah.
I
agree.
And I know we kind of did talk about this a little bit, but like, you know, if we talk about responsible and irresponsible AI use, do you think that, you know, as a professor, do you think that when you use, like, can you imagine a future in which maybe AI is used to teach or things like that, where it could be versions like irresponsible territory? We talk about these kind of like AI tutors and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Can you like foresee a class or a future where, you know, professors are using it irresponsibly? Maybe.
I mean, I think that such a world could exist. I mean, there's this thing called the dead classroom theory, which is like students using AI to like write their essays, and then AI, the teacher AI is like grading the essay, and it's like, what are we doing?
Right, like the dead internet before.
What are we doing? Right. And so certainly that could be a potential risk. I don't know that that's so likely, and I think it's kind of for the reason that you just described, which is like, it's an amazing technology, an amazing tool, but one that's a supplement and not a replacement. One where people are still coming to your office hours, people are still coming to my office hours, because there's something about this human interaction and human element. And what I am optimistic about is I think that it will make, in the long run, the sort of way that we teach better. You know, I feel good knowing that like there's this AI chatbot students can ask questions to, because some students don't want to come to my office hours. They're shy. They are working. They don't have to. It's not a good time. And so like, you know, students ask me for a study guide, but I have a bunch of other stuff. I can't always make a study guide. And so there's something that's a supplement to what I'm providing in the classroom. And then I get to spend time talking about research and like interacting with students in a different way than I did before this technology existed.
That's such a good point. It's like, you know, almost more of an assistant than like a replacement professor. I think this is the way we should be thinking about it. And it's definitely, I know, like, as a student, sometimes, you know, I think there is the idea of like, what if it's just, you know, an AI is like, look at this paper and saying, oh, well, you used AI or whatever it is, right? But I think that there is like solace to be had in the idea that no, there are humans on both ends of it still. And that's like still a good thing to have and to try to keep going as much as possible.
And I think at least for now, like the sort of dual use and the paired use produces a better output than AI by itself. You know, like if I ask AI to write a lecture, I don't think it's a very good. It produces a lecture, but like it's not the lecture I would give, and I don't think it's as good as the one that maybe I would write, but I think it can be helpful. I can ask the AI to review the lecture that I wrote, and it might be like, well, this part seems to go too fast, or like, students might have questions about this, or this logically doesn't make sense. And so then I'm like, oh, well, I wouldn't have ever asked somebody for feedback on my lecture because people are busy, but like now I'm improving my lecture.
Yeah, and that's such a good point. It's like it is always there, for better or for worse.
Right.
Which is nice. And I guess kind of the last question I have for you about, political science, like research and AI, all this stuff. I can say, there's definitely in research a lot of data cleaning, a lot of kind of very tedious work, right? And there's obviously very cool stuff, to build these models and things like that. There's a lot of work to get to that point of being able to do that. My question for you is, I know you mentioned briefly using AI in your work. Mm-hmm. Do you use it, and does it make it easier? Like what are you using it for?
Sure. So I use AI sort of across the research project, which I'll describe, but I want to say that I think that it doesn't necessarily make research easier, but it makes it different than how it was a few years ago. As you said, it's great at writing code, at finding data sources, at cleaning data sources. All of that is awesome, and I use it for many of those purposes. I also use it to, act like a reviewer of my paper and give me feedback. I might ask it if I'm being clear when I'm writing about something, if I want to learn about a new method that I haven't used before. Right now I'm working on a new paper about how members of Congress present themselves in images, and I've never worked with image data before. So this is like a new area where AI is helping me learn about that, and I might not have attempted that project if I wasn't confident that if I had to go through all the journals and read about this, that's a big undertaking, and I may have waited until a little later in my career to start going down this path. But now I feel like, I can learn things much faster. And so, AI is sort of, again, it's always there for better or worse. And so it is in the research project process, but I think where it may make some things better, to the extent that it's writing code for me that I'm then, of course, looking at and making sure that the code is, correct. That saves time though, because typing every single parentheses and hitting those errors, that saves me time.
Right.
But on the other end, I probably would not have had, my colleagues are all very generous, but they have their own research and teaching to do. So I can only ask them to review my paper one time before I send it out. Now I'm, having AI review my paper. I'm looking at those reviews. I'm seeing what I want to do or not do. I'm editing the paper. AI makes it easier to collect and analyze data. So I'm like, well, it doesn't cost me much to add this next part, to do this one more thing that maybe I wouldn't have attempted before because it would have just taken too much time. And so it makes some things easier, but it also makes other things harder or take long, maybe not harder, but my ambition is increased because I think I can do more now. And so I'm probably spending just as much time writing a paper, but what I'm spending time on isn't closing the 3 parentheses. It's thinking about, well, if I could find this other data source, could I use it? Or getting a sort of structured review from my paper and addressing comments before I send it out.
I really like that part of the increased ambition, because I think that's something that I didn't really think about, but that is true, right? You can do more. And I guess my kind of another question that I have about that, which, segues into this pretty perfectly, is, has research become more about, formatting the idea and kind of the fact of, this is what I want to do, this is my plan. Mm-hmm. Is that now the crux of the research, would you say? Or, are we there yet, or should we try to get to that point, do you think, in the research process?
I think we're getting there pretty quickly. People have done some pretty interesting, just little experiments. Other political scientists that I've seen have tried to use Claude Code to replicate a whole paper, and they had human validated, and it did pretty well. That was pretty impressive. But what I would say is that even if we are there, I would say that, I think that, again, there are always concerns about hallucination and cross-checking and using it responsibly. But I would say that, in the magical world where AI never made a mistake, political scientists at least would be happy about that. Most political scientists, I don't think, got into political scientists to write R and Python code. We got into it because we had questions about the world, hypotheses about how politics works, and we want to answer those questions with data. And pre-2023, the only way to do that was I got to write code, I got to download some data, I got to smash all this data together. And that was, I don't think, why anybody got into this field. And so now we have a tool that does some of that for us, and that lets us focus on the thing that we actually cared about in the first place, was the question. And then again, we can sort of increase our ambition of the questions that we ask, the way we answer these questions, the scope of projects.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I guess right now, I think in the class I've been taking, it is very much kind of the nitty-gritty of the data of figuring this about. But it's a super good point, the fact, I'm, whoever it is who's studying this stuff, I don't think you're doing it because you think that writing R is so much fun and you
Right.
want to do it so much, right? It's like, it is because you have these ideas, these hypotheses about, how the world works, how things are, and the fact that, thinking of AI not as a replacement, but as a tool.
Mm-hmm.
I really do think is a very valuable perspective to have on it,
Mhm.
because I think it can be very easy to also switch the perspective of, no, this is kind of the all-consuming, all-ending,
Yeah.
like, yeah, I don't know, let's say one of the 4 horsemen of our apocalypse, right? Whatever it is. But it's definitely, it does allow us to be able to kind of actually take into consideration what we want to be doing.
Yeah.
And like what's actually important, because, what's important, what can actually have an impact on policy, on, the world around us, is not the lines of, our code that I'm using to write regression, right? It's
Right.
like, it's the actual outcome of the paper. It's the whatever.
Right.
It's the saying, no, we believe this finding, says that if we increase, welfare coverage, whatever it is, right? If we increase this, people will have better lives. And that's the point of it.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah.
And I love what you said about it sort of being a tool rather than a replacement. I think that's the exact right way to think about it. And I think, this is not my unique analogy, but I think like a calculator is a good analogy
Yeah.
in that, again, I don't want to say that like on your first day of the data science program as a first year, you should just like, let me just like launch Cloud Code and never know what's happening.
Right,
But I think just like the calculator, I think you and I, if we had a whiteboard, we could like do some long division. That would probably be painful.
For sure.
But like, but I don't do long division. I have a calculator that does long division for me. But I know how long division works, and I had to learn that in whatever, 4th grade when I learned how long division works. But then I learned how that worked. I understand the process. Now I have a calculator that does that. I think it's the same thing here of like, it's good to understand the R or the Python code so that you can be a responsible user, know what is happening under the hood.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the answer is like never use AI, only ever write your own handcrafted R code.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think with that, I feel like we might maybe wrap up the podcast, but thank you so much, man. It's definitely awesome insights, and it's been great talking.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. This was so fun.
Of course, thank you.